So as its name implies, we're going to be looking at the orbital surface of the frontal. So this will be a ventral view. As we'll have our frontal lobes. And we'll have as landmarks here the olfactory tracts and olfactory bulbs that you see on the ventral surface of the frontal lobe. These represent olfactory tract. We'll have this later, an olfactory bulb. We're just using them now for a landmark. And our orbital frontal cortex then will be this area. It's orbital, frontal, as we see it from this plane. And it will deal with emotions. It has rich connections with the amygdaloid nucleus, or amygdala. Amygdala, or that's the noun, or amygdaloid nucleus, if you see it that way. And one of the emotions that the amygdaloid deals with mostly is fear. What does amygdala mean? Most people know. Almond. So you can picture its shape. It's the shape and size of an almond. And where is it? Whoops. Top of the screen. I got sort of a lopsided cortex here. Remember, we had the hippocampus deep in our temporal lobe, and just at the anterior end of the hippocampus here is our amygdala, or amygdaloid nucleus, which deals with many emotions, but fear predominantly. And it has connections with the hippocampus, with the hypothalamus. For emotional responses. So we're seeing lots of our cortex then deals with emotions, but this to just emphasize these, because this area is being worked on a great deal now. So let's see if there's anything more we want to say about our frontal lobe, or if that does it pretty well. Oh, one of the interesting things about our prefrontal cortex is its role in inhibition. You know, before you say something, you're weighing, should I say it or not? And more importantly, it should be not said many times. So we're very glad that part of our prefrontal cortex has an inhibitory function. Inhibitory function. Essentially, what not to say. And you'll find when you lecture too, all the time there's so much information that you think you want to say, but you're weeding that out and saying it's most important to keep on this track and don't bring in the other. But these inhibitory fibers become reduced with aging. You notice that? It's so much fun. Say what you want, when you want. Take the consequences. But in one area where I think it's rather humorous is that we all know swear words, but most of the time we don't use them. We've heard them all. We sort of look at somebody who uses them. We inhibit them. But for some people, as they get older, they lose that inhibition. I had a student come to me and she said she had a grandfather who was a famous judge down in Modesto. You know where Modesto is, down in the San Joaquin Valley. And as he got older, he was using all these profane words in every way. It was just shocked at him. It was so incongruous to his normal personality. But you don't know what's going to happen to you with aging. What is going to be lost for benefit or for worse? All right, that gives you a very brief picture of how dynamic your frontal lobes are. Let's move on to our parietal lobes. And here we've started with them already, where we had our central sulcus again. And we put in the post-central gyrus for primary sensory, post-central gyrus. And we said that we had our numbers here will be, we'll do it out here where we have more room to write, 3, 1, and 2. And why do we give 3 first? Because 3's down on the surface, this anterior surface of our post-central gyrus, and then 1 and 2. At the inferior aspect of the post-central gyrus, we'll have taste. We had our other sensory modalities, touch, pressure, superiorly, touch, pressure. What's the one we gave you in class? What sensory modality came to the post-central gyrus? Pain and temperature. And kinesthetic sense. What pathway in your spinal cord is bringing up kinesthetic sense to your post-central gyrus? If you don't remember the name of the pathway, think of how you divide your white matter in the cord. Do you remember it all? Should I wait here till somebody has the answer? Then you really have to start thinking. Posterior funiculus, sure. Gracilis and cuneate fasciculi, those are all conscious proprioception or kinesthetic sense. So now as we move back, let's come into, we'll have a sulcus. I'll just put it here. This sulcus is called the intraparietal sulcus. Intraparietal sulcus. So we'll have a superior parietal and an inferior parietal. What we want to look at first is what's happening in our inferior parietal cortex. So we're going to follow our lateral fissure back, and our lateral fissure curves up into our inferior parietal area. And the area at the end of the fissure is area 40. That's called the supramarginal gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus. If I follow my lateral fissure back into the inferior parietal area, What happens if you have a lesion there? Does anybody want to test with me whether he or she has a lesion in the... You want to come?
I'll do it.
Fine. Okay, turn around. Put out your right hand. Close, no, palm up. Close eyes. Now tell me what's there.
That's a piece of chalk.
Right. If he couldn't, he'd have what's called astereognosis. Some people can't. Very simple. You know whether that part of your brain is working. Congratulations. Yours is.
Oh, thank you.
Nice. Simple test. So the simple test for astereognosis, the ability to recognize something with touch. But it comes from a specific area of your cortex. So astereognosis means lack of. This is the condition. If you have a lesion in 40, you get astereognosis, lack of ability to recognize something with touch. And just think how important that is. You reach in your pocket for your keys, and you know whether you want your house key, your door key, or your car key, or whatever. You never think about it, do you? Just reach in, 2 seconds, you pull out one. This is the area that's working for you. So now we go back to we did 40 in yellow. We're going to follow the superior temporal sulcus back into inferior parietal. I don't want yellow. This will be area 39. This one is my superior temporal. Keep getting too much yellow chalk. Superior temporal sulcus. Coming to 39. 39 is what is known as the angular gyrus. It deals with such things as logic, math. They find if lesions are here, they have difficulty with these functions. But it also serves to integrate information from visual cortex. We're going to see in a moment auditory cortex. So we'll just put in integrate info from visual, auditory, and general sensory cortices. So now, knowing what you know about the cerebral hemispheres, our frontal and our parietal cortex, and you wanted to study to see which area is most intelligent compared to between people, which two areas might you take? Prefrontal and angular gyrus, exactly. That's why when we did Einstein's brain, we took area 39 and we took area 9. We wanted superior frontal and inferior parietal. So that's why it's important that if you're going to study in this field, that you know these areas so you know what would make, to invest that amount of time, you want to be sure you've got the areas that would possibly be involved. So let's go on then. We need now superior parietal. So we have 5 and 7 up here in superior parietal. And one of the reasons I want to give it to you, you may recall that when we talked about the cortical spinal tract, which was our primary motor tract, cortical spinal tract, we started with area 4. And we said it was primarily area 4 carrying voluntary motor down to the spinal cord. But I said there were adjacent inputs. But now that you've seen, we have 3, 1, and 2 here. They do contribute. We'll just turn them around to 1, 2, and 3. And we can contribute and 5. So all of these send into our cortical spinal tract. When I said adjacent areas. For years, we just taught area 4 until people found that these other areas are putting in too. So now what can we say about the superior parietal? That if I have a lesion on my right superior parietal, what syndrome will I develop? Have any of you heard of the neglect syndrome? Neglect syndrome. So a lesion on right parietal, you'll have a neglect syndrome. On the left superior parietal. No, we'll just put on the neglect syndrome on the left body, left side of the body, on left side of body. And this can vary in amount because you may get dressed in the morning. I've said this before, I'm sure, that you pull your jacket off and you quickly put your right arm in your right sleeve and your left arm in your left sleeve. If you have a lesion in your right superior parietal, you don't even know that there's a left side over here. You just neglect it. The way you'll do it in the office, if you have a patient, which is easy, you say, draw a clock. And they'll draw a clock and they'll put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they stop. Have no left input. All right? So obviously you have a healthy then 5 and 7 up here. So let's say that would be your introduction to your parietal lobe. Let's go back to the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe, I think so much has been done on vision, as I've said before, is that they thought it would be easier than anything else because it's only one modality coming back to our occipital lobe. And here we're going to define it by a preoccipital notch that you can see here on the inferior surface of the hemisphere. Preoccipital occipital notch, and a little bit coming over on the lateral surface here. We'll see it more on the medial in a moment. This is the parietal, occipital fissure. So if we draw an arbitrary line between these, we designate then our occipital lobe. But within it, we will have our numerical designations. We can have the occipital pole. This will be area 17. It's our primary visual cortex. This is called V1 in animal work. So many work on the monkey for the visual cortex. Then we have visual association surrounding it. So this will be area 18. And more medially, more anteriorly, we'll have area 19. And these two then will be your visual association cortices. And we've given you examples of how to think what your visual association cortex does for you. You can see the handle on your door as you go into your house, can't you? Right? Memory stored in your visual association cortices. Now, how does this look on the medial surface? Because we have much more on the medial surface for vision than we have on the lateral surface. You can see why one picture is worth 1,000 words. You have a lot of representation on your cortex for vision input. We'll put in our corpus callosum to let you know that this is a midline cut. And here we're going to introduce a fissure that we haven't had before. Does anybody know the name of the big fissure on the medial surface of the cortex in the occipital lobe? Pardon? Calcarine, right. Calcarine fissure, thank you. So, adjacent to the calcarine fissure, we will have a healthy representation of area 17. Then followed by 18. Followed by 19. So if you look carefully on this, you'll see at this position your preoccipital notch. And your parietal occipital fissure. So designating clearly a large representation of vision on the medial surface. Now, next time when we discuss the eye, we'll look at lesions for this because it depends on where in the system you're making your lesions, what kind of manifestations you'll have from the field of vision. So I think this will be an introduction to your occipital cortex, but just because it's vision, it doesn't mean that's the only thing that goes in to this part of the cortex. Hippocampus goes in, hypothalamus goes in, lots of other areas feed in. But it's primarily vision, and that's what most people study. So let's look now at the temporal lobe. And remember, this is all out, this is all lateral, and this is medial as we put in our next sensory modality into the temporal lobe. So we'll have the lateral fissure again. And we'll have the superior temporal gyrus coming back. And now we can put in an area on the superior temporal gyrus which will be your primary auditory cortex. And then it will be surrounded by, and primary auditory cortex is at area 41. It helps refine this by giving the numbers. Surrounded by auditory association cortex. And that will be area 42. And the rest of the superior temporal gyrus will be area 22. Anterior and posterior. Will be area 22. And again, it's auditory association cortex. Refining each time you go from the primary to another auditory association to the most refined auditory association. Now, what does posterior, I've read different things here, but I'll give you what Nolte says, because that's the book we use for our graduate course. He's just the author, who says that posterior 22 is for vestibular input. And so When we study the ear, you'll see that vestibular and auditory are part of the same 8th nerve, so represented on the same gyrus here. Now, another area in this region is called Wernicke's area. What's Wernicke's area for? What part of it? Pardon? Word understanding versus motor, like Broca's. So we're going to put in Wernicke's area, but I'm putting it in with a question mark because more recent research, but what I wanted to show here is look at visual representation versus auditory representation. Tremendous. So we're going to look at Wernicke's area. It's for word understanding. It's one thing to hear a word, it's another to understand what it means. And classical Wernicke's has always been in the area of the posterior, this area, posterior lateral fissure. That's classical Wernicke's. But George Ogeman, who's a neurosurgeon at the University of Washington, stimulates the brain trying to find a foci for an epileptic seizure so he can remove it. So he stimulates quite a bit of this left hemisphere. And he has found that Wernicke's area can be in many different places. But he stated that in his most intelligent patients, whatever that means, that he would find that Wernicke's area was down here in the middle. Let's put it one below. In the middle of the middle temporal gyrus. So if we have X's underlined, middle temporal gyrus, Wernicke's for more intelligent people. But I give these because you go to meetings today, and with our more refined technology, they're showing that these old classical areas served a purpose. All in the text, we all learn them, but with more refinement, they'll pick it up someplace else. Just like Broca's area, which was down here, 44 and 45, with more refined techniques. Peter Fox from Washington U in St. Louis, he was finding Broca's area all around here. So just to let you know, we teach you a basic that everybody knows, and then you know with more modern technology you'll get other pictures as well. So an experiment that went on with Wernicke's area recently down at UCLA was trying to find out whether there were more dendritic branches on nerve cells from people who had had different levels of education. So if you're going to try to figure out, thank you, what part of the brain you're going to look at, they figured that word understanding would be a good foundation to look for. So they had college graduates, they had this study going for dendritic branching in college graduates in Wernicke's area, high school graduates, and elementary school graduates. And they found that as you went up with more education, greater dendritic trees existed with college education. But it's just to show, because we did early work with our animals showing that with enrichment you get more dendrites. But people always say, well, can you do the same thing with humans? So this was the same thing with humans, where they had a gradation of little education. So when you're studying out there, students always tell me it hurts to learn. I said, those dendrites are trying to find their pathways, right? Please, what's your question? Were they the same age? I'd have to go back to the study, but enough that it was accepted in the scientific literature, so it was well done. Let's look at our slides, because I have some slides for you now. All right, here's our lateral view of our cortex. And we had our post-central gyrus, our pre-central gyrus, our central sulcus. And then this would be area 4, pre-central, voluntary motor. And then premotor, where you'd have planning on the other side. And then we'd have our conjugate eye movements coming in with 8, and then 9, 10, and 11. Our orbital gyrus would be 11 down here. Here's our 44 and 45 for Broca's area in the classical sense. Our superior temporal gyrus, and right here you'd have auditory, primary auditory, that's called Heschel's gyrus. You'll see Heschel in your vocabulary words. So you'll get that clinically when they talk about auditory. They'll say, where's Heschel's gyrus? You know it's on superior temporal gyrus. And here's your middle temporal gyrus. And we can see that if we follow the middle temporal sulcus back, this will be the angular gyrus here. And if we follow the the lateral fissure back, this is supramarginal, 40, 39, very important, inferior parietal areas, and then your superior parietal areas will be up here. If this is my post-central gyrus, 5 and 7 would be here. And then our preoccipital notch would be here. And you'll see a little of the parietal occipital sulcus here in this one, very small lateral portion of our visual cortex. And our prefrontal here, which is most highly evolved. As I ask the students frequently, are we going to continue to go forward, or with stress will it take us back? What would your father say to that one? It's a question for him. He's an evolutionary biologist, so we can find out what he would project. In the next one, this is just to show without all the markings, so you can do this on your own now. You look for your preoccipital notch, would be right in here, and this parietal occipital fissure would be coming in here, join the two. Again, very small occipital cortex here. Here's your superior temporal gyrus, so you'd have your Heschel's gyrus right here with the association fibers around it and centers, and take it on back for vestibular. Here's your primary sensory cortex, primary motor, and so forth. But look at, this is a big, my goodness, what a talker. Look at Broca's area. Think professors have bigger ones? What do you know? Here we go. Next one, please. And this gives us our, you see how marked is our parietal occipital fissure on the medial surface. Here's the calcarine fissure. So very clearly do you see the delineation here. It's a little hard to say which of these would be a preoccipital notch from here to take this up. But here's primary vision on each side of the calcarine fissure, and then visual association surrounding it. And here's our corpus callosum. In the next one, and this will show our medial orbital cortex here, which is actually 11. Here are, what are they? Olfactory tracts with olfactory bulbs, right. Next one. And this will show that the posterior cerebral artery will supply our visual cortex. It also will supply inferior temporal. Now, can everybody in class tell me what artery this is? I don't hear a thing. Middle cerebral. Right. I told you my physics professor drilled F equals ma, and we say it in our sleep even now. So I want you to remember middle cerebral. And then you have the anterior cerebral creeping over the top. So if you have an anterior cerebral lesion, you can be paralyzed in your feet with your upside down homunculus. Here's the anterior cerebral on the medial surface. These on the cortex are going to bring many patients into your offices, so you should know them well. In the next one, and here's the insula. We didn't have time to talk about the insula, but it sort of is a part of the cortex which got lost behind. When Nina Dronkers comes to speak to you on, she's a speech pathologist, she'll let you know that this has something to do with speech that they found in more recently. They used to say it was dealing with visceral functions, very general. In the next one, now who can tell me what's wrong with these brains? Now that you're young neuroanatomists, what's missing? The corpus callosum. Evidently 1% of the people don't have a corpus callosum. Do you have yours? I don't know if I have mine. But this was a brain that we had in class. It came to us, the man, what did he do? He died of emphysema. And the brain was a whole brain. My students cut it in half to begin to study, and they stood back. You could tell something was wrong. They said, this is not a normal brain. And we went back, and sure enough, the corpus callosum was not here. You don't have a cingulum gyrus like you have with the corpus callosum there. So we called the hospital. It turned out it was a 42-year-old male. He had had emphysema, and that's what he died of. There was no record because medical records don't take behavioral data. It's one thing we're missing when we have our checkups. So what we look for then, this is his anterior commissure. It's about 3 times the size as a normal anterior commissure. So something was trying to compensate, but definitely it couldn't compensate for a whole corpus callosum. And his massa intermedia here in the thalamus is bigger. Anyhow, next one. This is to show pyramidal cells in your cortex. We didn't have time for neurohistology. And these fibers that are light are all recurrent collaterals coming into the cortex off of the axons that are leaving. Next one. And this shows that layer 1 of your cortex has no pyramidal cells or no stellate cells. Next one. Next one, please. This is a pyramidal cell. 2 kinds of cells to make your cortex for all of your ideas come from pyramidal cells or stellate cells. Next one. These are stellate cells. Next one. What do you think of this? Sort of playing with knowledge. We start with a single circle. We develop 1 dendrite. Ignorance. We add some knowledge. With that knowledge, we get creativity and reason. Then we begin to think of others, love, generosity. But wisdom doesn't come until the 6 ordered dendrites because you have such a broad spectrum to sample. And we showed in our old animals, this is where we could still show growth with aging in wisdom. So we drew this little cartoon for you. So that's I had to say something about cortical cortex because we go to vision the next time.